Well, good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Good. My name's John Horrigan, and it's a pleasure to be back here in Norfolk, talking to my friends. And this being late February, where we had some marvelous weather to go along with that drenching rain, we're 157 years out from something known as the Baltimore Plot. The Baltimore Plot is a conspiracy that was festering in the city of Baltimore, Maryland, not at the end of Lincoln's first term, but before he even ascended to the presidency. He had been elected, and he was taking a train ride to be inaugurated in Washington, D.C., but he had to go through Baltimore first. And that's what our story is about today. We're going to look at Abraham Lincoln briefly, a man by the name of Allan Pinkerton, what the term private eye means, the Baltimore Plot, and then we'll look at the inaugural train ride and how he's going to slip through Baltimore. And then we'll look at the inauguration. So Abraham Lincoln, as you know, the 16th President of the United States, born on February 12, 1809, passed away on April 15, 1865. He actually was assassinated late on the evening of April 14, 1865, when he was shot by John Wilkes Booth, but didn't pass away until early the next morning. An American statesman, he was also a lawyer, and he served as President of the United States from March of 1861 up until his assassination at the conclusion of the Civil War. And his direction and leadership of the United States, still fledgling, trying to keep a union together that was divided by 13 states that seceded. Of course, he was on the Union side. And he is considered perhaps the greatest moral, constitutional, and maybe even the most evocative president that ever assumed the title in the United States. He was a man who eviscerated honesty and integrity. And as you know, he was against slavery. He could be considered an abolitionist. And he sought to strengthen the federal government and modernize the American economy. And in the early 1830s, he met Mary Owens. She was from Kentucky, and she was visiting her sister. And he was actually dating Mary's sister, but he became engaged to Mary, who was from a wealthy slaveholding family from Lexington, Kentucky. And they were eventually married on November 4th, 1842. Now, after Lincoln passed away, Mary had a lot of psychological issues, and she always dressed in black. And this is a famous photograph you've probably seen taken after Abraham's death of this image showing up behind her with its hands on its shoulders. It's considered an early form of spirit photography, but it looks remarkably like Abraham Lincoln, doesn't it? Famous ghost photograph if you talk to ghost researchers. So if you look at Abraham Lincoln, he was born in Hodgenville, Kentucky, but he grew up on the western frontier, what was known as the western frontier in the 1830s of the United States, in Kentucky and Indiana. And he was nicknamed the Rail Splitter by his rivals, especially his political rivals later on in life, because he worked at one time in his life creating wooden beams for the fledgling railroad. The railroad was just beginning to expand westward across the U.S. in 1830, culminating at Promontory Point in Utah in 1869 when the Transcontinental Railroad was complete. You can see these young pictures of a young Lincoln here. He was elected into the Illinois House of Representatives and served from 1834 to 1846. Before that, he had his law degree, and he was a fledgling lawyer. And then he was elected into the United States House of Representatives and became a congressman in 1846. And one of the things he did was to promote rapid modernization of the country, because we were in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And he was virulently opposed to the Mexican-American War that followed after the seizure of the Alamo and the expansion of the United States. But he was a prairie lawyer at heart, and he was known to take any case pro bono, whether it was neighbor against neighbor or even murder cases. And he decided that after his term in the U.S. House of Representatives representing the state of Illinois that maybe politics wasn't for him. So he went back to his law practice and was very successful. And then he got a little restless, and he decided to return to politics in 1854. And he became one of the leaders in building the new Republican Party. Lincoln was a Republican, not a Democrat. And I need to disclose this, that it were the Republicans that were against slavery. in the middle of the 19th century. Democrats were pro-slavery. So he had a statewide majority in Illinois, very popular, and he became a leader of the new Republican Party. They liked him and they believed in him, an eloquent spokesman, though he wasn't a loud orator like a William Jennings Bryan, and people had to strain to hear him. Very soft-spoken. So as part of the 1858 campaign for U.S. Senator, now again he was a state rep, U.S. rep, now he's running for Senator of Illinois, he had to take part in a series of debates, and these were very highly publicized, against his rival and opponent, Democrat Stephen A. Douglas. And it was here that Lincoln made his mark, speaking out against slavery. But unfortunately, he lost the race to Douglas. But that didn't deter him. In 1860, he secured the Republican Party presidential nomination. He was a moderate from a swing state, Illinois. And though most delegates favored other candidates, and he gained very little support from the slave-holding states of the South, somehow the North voted for him, and he won, getting just a little over 40% of the vote, and became president, elected in 1860. And it's early in the morning of November 6th, 1860, and an excited man awakens his wife. Mary, Mary, we are elected. Abraham Lincoln had just been elected the 16th president of the United States, but he was taking control of a very divided nation. And just 6 weeks after his election in January of 1861, South Carolina would be the first of 13 states to secede from the Union during his first year of office. Now, just looking at this secession map, and you'll see it's a GIF, but soon 6 more states would secede. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. They followed the lead of South Carolina and seceded from the Union. Louisiana and Texas would soon follow. Maryland, though, Maryland, where Baltimore is located, just north of Washington, D.C., was roiling with anti-Northern sentiment in the months leading up to Lincoln's election. And at the very moment that he was elected, the South was infuriated. So conceivably, Maryland was about to secede from the Union, and Washington, D.C., where the capital of the United States could conceivably be, in a state, surrounded by a state that had seceded from the Union. So, it's at this moment that a man by the name of Samuel Morse Felton, president of a very viable and strong railroad, voiced his concerns because he was wondering what that would do to his railroad should the North and South polarize and the southern states secede from the Union of the United States. So, Felton, and you can see all the states, and then there were territories. Let me just mark this over here. There were territories here, Kansas, Missouri, and uncharted United States territories here that weren't dedicated to slavery. But throughout Lincoln's presidency and after his presidency, the United States was moving westward. And this termination, the Mason-Dixon line, would determine west versus south. But again, the District of Columbia, right here conceivably, could be surrounded by 2 states that had seceded from the Union, Virginia and Maryland. So, Samuel Morse Felton, he was president of the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad line, was worried about his railroads. Now, in those days, in the 1860s, again, the Transcontinental Railroad had not been completed, but these were the first magnates, railroad magnates. They had different rail lines that didn't connect. A rail line would terminate in one area, and then the station to take the next rail line that wasn't owned by that particular railroad would begin. So there were different gauges of tracks, widths of tracks. There were different types of locomotives and speeds and cars. So the railroad at that time wasn't unified. But Samuel Morse Felton, his railroad ran throughout the North and into the South. And he was aware of threats to his rail lines because in the event of war, conspirators or Southern spies would blow up the railroad, his tracks, bridges, tunnels, so they could prevent the Union from moving troops and supplies and vital necessities to conduct a campaign. Now, this was a vital transportation network. And he set out and he said that there was a deep-laid conspiracy to capture Washington, D.C. This is Samuel Morse Felton speaking. Destroy all of the avenues leading to it from the north, east, and west. And thus, he thought, concluded, to prevent the inauguration of Mr. Lincoln in the capital of the country. So in other words, while he was investigating the threats against his rail line, one of his people also stumbled upon a conspiracy to destroy Washington, D.C. and perhaps harm the president-elect. Now, Lincoln would be taking a train ride from his home state in Springfield, Illinois, to the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., for his presidential inauguration, which would take place on March 4th, 1861. It was about 250 miles, and it wasn't directly north to the southeast. He would be making several stops along the tour, and Lincoln insisted that he utterly disliked, quote, ostentatious display and empty pageantry, and he would make his way to Washington without a military escort, just a bodyguard and a couple of secretaries. Moreover, his route to Washington was published. Everybody knew when he would arrive, this precise time at each railroad station across the nation as he moved from Illinois down to Washington, D.C. So, enter this man. Now, Samuel Morse Felton had contacted his then chief of operations of the railroad at the time, by the name of George McClellan, who was then chief of staff and chief of operations for Samuel Morse Felton's railroad. And it was McClellan who came upon a possible conspiracy to harm Lincoln on his train ride to Washington. This man here is Allan Pinkerton. In 1849, he became a detective for the state of Illinois. He was a Scottish immigrant, and he would form the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which, believe it or not, is still in existence today as Pinkerton Consulting and Investigations, which is a subsidiary of Securitas AB. But Pinkerton was a wise private investigator and had made his mark and his reputation for solving train robberies or thwarting train robberies and other threats against the railroad. So this happened across the 1850s, and so George McClellan, the first man he thought of was Allan Pinkerton to give him a call. So, Pinkerton, just to give you some backstory, he married Joan CARFRAE, who was a singer in Glasgow, Scotland, on March 13th, 1842. And then later that year, the newlyweds would emigrate to the United States and locate in the central or the western part of the United States at that point in Illinois. So anyways, Samuel Felton, after hearing back from George McClellan, contacted the nation's leading detective and lawman, Allan Pinkerton. And at that time, he was 41 years old. He had his own detective agency. And moments after he had received Felton's letter, Pinkerton packed up his bags and went from Chicago to Philadelphia, where he arrived on January 21st, 1861. He met with Felton. And upon hearing Felton's plea for help, the detective said, and I apologize for the poor Scottish accent, but it aroused me to a realization of the danger that threatened the country, and I determined to render whatever assistance was in my power. Now, Allan Pinkerton was an abolitionist, and he also worked on the Underground Railroad, which was a vast network and pathways to the northern United States and Canada. And he would provide safe houses. He was known as a conductor. They used railroad terminology in the Underground Railroad. It was technically not really underground, nor was it a railroad. And he would provide shelter, direction, and more importantly, fooding and clothing to the escaped slaves as they tried to make their way to the north. It was a network, a vast network of secret routes and safe houses that were used by 19th century slaves of African descent. And again, their goal was to get to the north in Canada. A lot of them made their way across the Great Lakes into the province of Ontario. If they were in the deep south, they would travel into Illinois, Indiana, parts of Ohio, Michigan to get to Canada, and then some would make their way to New England. Now, as I have a separate lecture about Underground Railroad, but I'm always hearing about different houses that were allegedly safe houses or stations, even in the Massachusetts area, whether it was Old Route 16, Old Route 20. And the reason why these houses were selected is because they were in remote areas. Everyone knew everyone. And if a slave hunter or a slave catcher came into town, everybody would hear about it. So still, effectively, the South lost about 100,000 slaves during the Underground Railroad, which roughly went from the beginning of the 19th century through the 1860s until the Emancipation Act was passed, Emancipation Proclamation. But between 1810 and 1860, they think about 100,000 slaves made their way north. And of course, abolitionists, it's a term applied to both black and white, free and enslaved Africans who aided the fugitives. And of course, they would be hidden out in attics, basements, and cellars, even behind bookcases. And the slaves would mainly travel at night in small groups, mostly male. It was difficult for women to travel and children, namely because children would make noise, and women were often not allowed off the plantation, so they had no idea of what the landscape was beyond the confines of the plantation. Men could travel into town, but when they escaped, they would travel in pairs or 1 to 3. And it was compartmentalized, the Underground Railroad. So the slaves and the station masters who were hiding them out only knew their portion of the route, and they could only point them in the direction to the next safe house. So they'd have to travel at night, though. The escaped slaves could not travel during the day. And if they traveled at night, less chance of being seen, more dangerous in terms of it was hard to see, and they couldn't use torches, but they would look up into the northern sky at what we call today the Big Dipper. And they knew that the lid of the Big Dipper points to the North Star. It's not a very bright star, Polaris. But they called this constellation the Drinking Gourd, and they had songs to go along with it. And they knew if they followed that, that would get them north, somehow, some way. This man here is John Brown. And Allan Pinkerton understood that the radical secessionists sought to prevent the inauguration. And Brown was an abolitionist. But what Brown did is he made an attempt at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. He came in and killed 5 slavery supporters. And he led an unsuccessful raid against Harper's Ferry that ended with his capture and execution. So there was radical elements on both sides, but Brown, historians point to his act at Harper's Ferry was probably the precipitant that set off the South and the secessionists for the Civil War, because he was an abolitionist. Now, if you look at Allan Pinkerton, he had the logo here, "We Never Sleep," and his logo was the open eye, hence the word private eye. Some people think it comes from private investigator, shortening, but you could see the logo, "We Never Sleep." And when Pinkerton revolutionized the art of solving crimes, and he was the first, as I mentioned, detective and investigator in the United States, and he would use all sorts of methods. In fact, in this plot, he would bring with him 3 of his top agents, Harry Davies, and Davies was an unassuming, laid-back man, raised in the South, and could present the facade of being an aristocratic Southern gentleman. So he would be used. And Davies had learned this growing up in New Orleans and other cities. So what Pinkerton had to do is get together his best team. And he would use with him, along with his top agents, I'm going to get to 2 more in a moment, Timothy Webster and Kate Warren, but he would use various disguises, okay? And he would have his agents placed undercover, posing as individuals with professions in which they were not. He would also use coded messages, especially through the telegraph, because every time a telegraph message was tapped out, at each individual telegraph station, the message could be read. It was Morse code, so he had to use coded language. And he also formulated a wanted list, the most wanted list that he'd post in his office in terms of the most wanted criminals that time in the area and in the United States, and what the bounty was worth if he captured them. Enter this woman. In 1856, Kate Warren was just a young widow, and she stunned Allan Pinkerton when she appeared at his Chicago headquarters asking for a job. Pinkerton responded, "I'm sorry, but we already have a secretary." She said, "Not as a secretary, but as a detective." And Pinkerton was stunned. He said, I could not consider exposing a woman to the dangers of the field of private investigations. And she said, well, just think about it. I can get to your men, the men you're after, through their women, through their wives, through their sisters, through their daughters, through their girlfriends. I would be a great asset to your organization. Pinkerton sent her away. Thank you, Ms. Warne. Nice to meet you. Come back in the morning and I'll give you my answer. So Pinkerton thought about it overnight and said, that's a splendid idea. Kate Warne would become Allan Pinkerton's right-hand asset. I don't want to say man, but right-hand personnel. He relied on her for everything. He confided in her on every single matter of business within the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Inasmuch as that she was buried next to Pinkerton at his plot when he was in the same graveyard as Allan Pinkerton. Another man he brought in was Timothy Webster. Webster again came in, a Canadian came into the fold. Green was a former police officer, became one of Pinkerton's confidants, and he would pose in a lot of these traps that they'd set as the husband of Kate Warne. They'd be husband and wife. And that was part of the plan when they would move to Baltimore. They had to get to the heart of the conspiracy and set up their web of detection down there. So down to Baltimore would go Pinkerton, Harry Davies, who would pose as a wealthy Southern gentleman, Timothy Webster, and Kate Warne, posing as husband and wife. And Webster later would be caught as a Union spy and executed due to an inadvertent disclosure by Pinkerton in a local newspaper divulging his identity. Another story. So, they would be embedded in Baltimore. Pinkerton would go down and set up his identity and his persona as a Southern stockbroker by the name of John Hutchinson. Harry Davies, meanwhile, would set it up also his way as a different persona, a Southern gentleman. So Pinkerton rented an office building here in Baltimore and wanted to open up a business to create a facade that he was a Southern businessman in Baltimore. And he happened to be right across the hall in a suite of offices in a large office building to authenticate his role or portrayal or his character as a Southern stockbroker. And there he met James Luckett. Now, Luckett was, again, a well-off man, pro-South, a secessionist, and he was part of the conspiracy. Luckett was helping to finance this palmetto organization, this organization that would wear a palmetto on their lapel to show that they were Southern sympathizers. And Luckett, and Pinkerton knew this, somehow was financially aiding and abetting these saboteurs, these conspirators. So what Pinkham, he did, posing as John H. Hutchinson, what he decided to do is offer money to Luckett, $25, a large sum in that day. And Allan Pinkerton just said, I support your cause. Do what you wish with this money. I don't need to know what you're doing, but just do this for the cause and get it to the right people. And there he won over Luckett, and he had Luckett's confidence. Meanwhile, Harry Davies had befriended Otis Hillard. Hillard was known to hang out in the Barnum Hotel. Okay, seen at the bar. He was an alcoholic, heavy drinker, and Davies befriended him and began to meet with him every day, pay for his drinks, also posing as a Southern sympathizer. And day by day, night by night, drink by drink, he gained Otis Hillard's confidence to the point that Davies asked Hillard if I can join this conspiracy. And Hillard said, oh, no, it's closed. I'm sorry, I can't disclose anything else. Well, Hillard, the more he got in him over the next few days, would disclose what was going on at the Barnum Hotel. So as I mentioned, Harry Davies portrayed a wealthy and extreme anti-union man from New Orleans who was looking to finance any pro-South venture. And he circulated amongst the elites and the radicals, as did Kate Warne and Timothy Webster. And they could sense in Baltimore the discontent and the hatred towards Abraham Lincoln. They knew that something was brewing. They just couldn't put their finger on it. What was the plan? As I mentioned, Abraham Lincoln hated ostentatious display and empty pageantry and would make his way out to the inauguration in Washington, D.C. from Springfield, Illinois. And at that point in time, his secretary, his press secretary, he had two secretaries, John NICOLAY, said, "I could hear the most outrageous sentiments enunciated. No man's life was safe in the hands of those men." So NICOLAY, his press secretary, was reading all of this hate mail towards Abraham Lincoln and brought it to Lincoln's attention. And Lincoln couldn't even imagine that a person would have that much hatred towards another person simply because he was president of the United States. NICOLAY said, "The mail was infested with brutal and vulgar menace, and warnings of all sorts came to him from zealous or nervous friends. Poison, even somebody threatened to put a poisonous spider in one of the dumplings in Lincoln's soup." But NICOLAY said that he himself, Lincoln he's talking about, so sane a mind, in a heart so kindly, even to his enemies, that it was hard for him to believe in political hatred so deadly as to lead to murder. This was inconceivable to Lincoln. Now, John Hay was Lincoln's personal secretary, attended to basically his executive assistant, attended to his every need, and he was the one who got John NICOLAY, the press secretary, the job. So they would be traveling, those two men, NICOLAY and Hay, along with the president. And here he is photographed, John Hay, John NICOLAY, with the president, on his inaugural train ride. But to further complicate matters, Lincoln's itinerary, as I mentioned, was made public. Anybody could obtain the exact time and location of his arrival at any station or stop. He'd be traveling overall, even though it's a 250-mile run from, as the crow flies, the total distance of the trip would be about 2,000 miles. The goal was to arrive in Calvert Street Station on February 23rd, early on, and then depart from Camden Street Station, which was a few blocks away, just a few hours later. So, in other words, hearkening back to my opening remarks, the train line that would end at Calvert Street Station, Samuel Morse Felton's, he'd have to take a carriage across town to the Camden Street Station to continue on his route from Philadelphia to Baltimore and eventually on to Washington, D.C. And the distance between the two stations is a little over a mile, and Pinkerton had heard rumblings in Baltimore that that's when Lincoln would be attacked. The plan would be to cause some sort of commotion or distraction, just as Lincoln got into the carriage leaving Calvert Street Station on his way to Camden Street Station. The police would be distracted, they'd be drawn away, and that's where the assassination would take place, and the assassins would pounce on him, either with a knife or a gun. But as you can see, Abraham Lincoln, not the loudest voice, would stop at these whistle stops, get off and meet his constituents, or speak from the back of the railway car. Now, his imminent arrival was the buzz-all, and that's all people were talking about in Baltimore. Kate Warren knew this, Timothy Webster knew this, Harry Davis knew this, and Allan Pinkerton knew this. Pinkerton thought it was a city waiting to explode in anger. And as I mentioned, there was even a chance that Maryland, by the time Lincoln arrived, would have seceded from the Union. So, Pinkerton was trying to formulate a plan to protect the president, but be inconspicuous at the same time. Whether they went into stores or restaurants or taverns, they could hear the discontent festering amongst the residents there. But eventually, the train would leave from Lincoln's hometown of Springfield, Illinois, make its way west to the state line of Indiana, proceed on to Lafayette, Indianapolis, Indiana, then on to the southwestern corner of Ohio and Cincinnati, up to Columbus, Ohio, Steubenville, into Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, back into Alliance, Ohio, Cleveland, on to Erie, Pennsylvania, Westfield, New York, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Albany, Poughkeepsie, and then make its way down to New York City, from there to Trenton, New Jersey, to Philadelphia, out to Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania, back to Philadelphia, and then down to Baltimore and Washington. So, There were 72 whistle stops on Lincoln's tour. And on the morning of February 11th, 1861, that's when Abraham Lincoln began packing his suitcases. And on them were just simply scrawled, A. Lincoln, White House, Washington, D.C. So just before Lincoln departed, he said in Springfield, Illinois, he said, "My friends, no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place," he's talking about Springfield, Illinois, "and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. I now leave, not knowing when or whether I may return to a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington." He's talking about George Washington, and also kind of foreshadowing his death. So you can see the various stops, and it's marked by the different stops all the way along the way. He would make his way to the District of Columbia. And here you see a photograph of Lincoln, and again, on the back of the train talking to the crowd. Sometimes he'd get off and get mobbed. And again, he was traveling with a bodyguard, and I'll get to him in a second, and 2 secretaries. So anybody that wanted to go at Lincoln could have firsthand access to him. Of course, there was a higher police presence in the northern states, but that would lighten up as they went to the south. But he met some nice women. This is Grace BEDELL, a young lady who wrote to him, wishing him luck as president, and Lincoln responded with this letter, "I regret the necessity of saying I have no daughters. I have 3 sons, one 17, one 9, and one 7 years of age." But he just wished her well, and he actually got to meet her at one of the whistle stops in New York. So, Allan Pinkerton, meanwhile, is hearing about this cabal, this plot to assassinate Lincoln in Baltimore, Maryland. And coming from Illinois, he had briefly run into Lincoln when Lincoln was a lawyer. They had briefly met. And later in life, Pinkerton would become a scout for the Civil War, for the Union, for Abraham Lincoln. But he also knew a state senator by the name, U.S. senator by the name of Norman Judd, the U.S. senator from Illinois. And he said, "I have to get a message to Judd. I need to speak to Judd and apprise him of the situation so he can let Lincoln know that his life may be in danger when he goes through Baltimore." So he had Kate Warne go up and meet Judd when the train came through New York City, pass him a letter. And Kate was determined, and all the letter basically essentially said, "You need to speak with Allan Pinkerton at once. It's extremely urgent." Judd sent her back, said, "I can meet with him in Philadelphia." As I mentioned, this is a picture of Pinkerton and Lincoln during the Civil War. Pinkerton would make assertions and assumptions on troop strength of the South during the Civil War, and on a couple of occasions he overestimated the amount of troops that the Confederate Army was marshaling and positioning, causing the Union Army to move, in some cases, in the wrong direction. But another story. He wasn't the best of scouts. Allan Pinkerton's plan was simple. Originally, Lincoln's train was to come into the Calvert Street station. There, his sleeper car would be uncoupled and then drawn by horse to the Camden Street station, which would take him on to Baltimore and then on to Washington, D.C. Pinkerton's plan was twofold. Number one, bring Lincoln into Baltimore ahead of schedule. But instead of going to the Calvert Street station, he would take the president on a train to the President Street station. From there, they would uncouple the sleeper car and take it to the Camden Street station and then on to Baltimore. Now, Abraham Lincoln's bodyguard, aside from the 2 secretaries, John Hay and John NICOLAY, was Ward Hill LAMON, or Ward Hill LAMON, depending upon who you speak to. Very tall man. I'm going to show you back in the previous photograph. They said that if you opened his overcoat, you'd find a pistol in each side, a Bowie knife in each side, a knife and brass knuckles, heavily armed, a fighter, and he was the man for the job to protect Lincoln. And just to show you that Ward Hill LAMON, just want to show you, if you see this large guy right here, look at the size of LAMON. Okay. So, he's got an able and willing bodyguard, and he and Pinkerton did not get along so much. LAMON thought that Pinkerton was usurping his job description. So when Lincoln got into New York City, the crowds loved him. His life wasn't in danger. There were some potential dangers put down, but met the people in town. He was the toast of the city. This is where Kate Warren originally met Senator Judd to tell him that Allan Pinkerton needs to speak with you and would like to meet with you once you get to Philadelphia. So, in Philadelphia, the presidential train arrives. Pinkerton meets with Judd, explains the dire urgency of him speaking to the president, and Judd understood, and he had that conspiracy corroborated by other people. And Judd said, I don't know if the president will accede to these demands. I don't think he'll believe them. So later that night, just before Lincoln's train was to depart to Harrisburg, Pinkerton had 15 minutes with him, laid out the plot. Your life is in danger. All I want to do is get you through Baltimore ahead of schedule. And Lincoln again was just dismayed that anybody would try to make an attempt in his life. And he said, I'll go along with the plan as long as it doesn't interrupt my itinerary so I can meet with the people who voted for me, the citizens of the United States. And he took a train out to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, had dinner, met the governor. He excused himself early from the dinner, packed his bag, including a shawl, and snuck out the side door and was taken to the train station, back to Philadelphia. So do you follow? So let me just go back to the map just so we can briefly see where we're going here. So he went, here we go. So he went to Philadelphia, made a speech in Harrisburg, had dinner, snuck out the back door, took a train, an 11 o'clock train back to Philadelphia. Okay. Now when they got into Philadelphia on the train ride, the engineer was told that he had a special package, not to look back. And one of the train workers spotted Lincoln on the train, his profile, as they were pulling out. And he says, well, you have a special package here. And he said to the conductor, the rail splitter is on the train, meaning Lincoln. The conductor told him, don't you tell anybody that. You know, on the way out of Harrisburg, another phase of Pinkerton's plan was to cut down all telegraph wires in case he was spotted. So once he left Harrisburg, somebody could easily tap out messages to the conspirators in the awaiting cities, whether it be Philadelphia, Baltimore. So they would clip the wires so no communications could come in or out. So, meanwhile, Kate Warren is trying to secure a sleeper car just for Lincoln's party. The conductor says, I'm sorry, the train sold out. But this is my invalid brother. He's very sick and can't be disturbed. I need an entire sleeper car. Because in those days, anybody could walk into any sleeper car going from a car to the next. And she was on the verge of tears, and finally the conductor relented and sold her the tickets to the sleeper car. So she's completed her phase of the plan, and the plan was to put a shawl over Lincoln. He was very tall, no stovepipe hat, and walk him to the train, out of the carriage and onto the train at Philadelphia. So they get into Philadelphia. Unfortunately, they arrive an hour early at 10 p.m. It was an 11 o'clock train, and they couldn't leave Lincoln exposed, sitting on the train that had to leave or sitting in a carriage. So Pinkerton, Lincoln, and Ward Hill Lamon went on a coach ride, and Pinkerton deliberately gave the man that was driving the carriage wrong direction, so he'd go throughout Philadelphia to waste away the time for that hour. And at 10:55 p.m., in came the carriage. They walked Lincoln on with a shawl with Kate posing as his sister, and he was the invalid brother, onto the train in Philadelphia, and off they went. So meanwhile, let's go back let's go to Baltimore. So all the while, it was Harry Davies who was getting closest to the center of the conspiracy. Harry Davies was the special agent who had made friends with the drunkard Otis Hillard, okay, who was part of the central conspiracy group planning the assassination and attack on Abraham Lincoln in Baltimore. And Davies pleaded, let me be the man that does the deed. Let me be the man who will live in infamy to kill the president. And finally, Hillard relented and went to the leader of the conspiracy, a man by the name of Cipriano Ferrandini, an Italian immigrant, an Italian anarchist. He was the barber in the Barnum Hotel just below where the bar was. So every man that came through, he knew every man that came through for a haircut and could talk to them about the conspiracy. He knew who could be trusted, who could not be trusted. And he became the center of the conspiracy, a very bright man. In fact, Pinkerton would meet him in a bar via James Luckett a few days earlier and say that he was just mesmerizing with his speech. He could win over anyone with his tongue. And he could see why people would follow this man, Cipriano Ferrandini. And Ferrandini would swear, he will never become president. Never. So the meeting, the secret meeting, was held, and they were going to determine who would be selected to kill Lincoln at Baltimore, who would attack him. Harry Davies, the agent, won over Otis Hillard, the drunk, his confidence, and Hillard finally got permission to take Davies to the meeting. Ferrandini swore him in. The lights obviously were dimmed, just a few candles, and there was a ceremony performed with Ferrandini with a sword above his shoulder, proclaiming how vile the North is and how that Lincoln will never become president. Each man was to draw a ballot in silence. Whoever had the red mark on their ballot would be the assassin. No one was to disclose to anybody in that room or anybody outside of that building who had the red ballot. And you weren't to say if you had it or not. You were sworn to confidence. Each man proceeded by the ballot box, including Davies. Davies pulled out his ballot, opened it up, no red mark. Hillard and Davies said, let's go get a drink across the street. They went to a bar. And as the night wore on, Hillard disclosed that he did not have a mark on his ballot. And he asked Davies the same. He said, I did not. He says, wow, because he had found out that Ferrandini had not put one red ballot in the ballot box, but 8. There would be 8 separate assassins left to their own devices to attack Abraham Lincoln as he came into Baltimore. At the Barnum Hotel, this man, does anybody know who this man is here? He was seen in frequenting the Barnum Hotel and was known about the Southern conspiracy. Anybody? John Wilkes Booth. That's right. So 4 years later, he would indeed do the act. And some could say that he was inspired by Cipriano Ferrandini. Pinkerton's plan was simple. Arrive in Baltimore early and also get him to a different train station. When they got into Baltimore, they would be ahead of the cabal and the conspirators. Therefore, the people that were trying to assassinate the president weren't even out of bed yet. But one problem. Police Chief Marshal Kane from the Baltimore Police was in on the conspiracy. The plan was, originally, for Lincoln's train to come into Calvert Street Station. There, his group would be distracted by some sort of disturbance, and the police officers led away from Lincoln, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. So, the plan was not to go to Calvert Street Station, where the saboteurs were awaiting. Pinkerton said, why don't we take the line out of Philadelphia to the President Street Station in Baltimore? And then from there, they would uncouple the car, take it about a mile to the Camden Street Station, attach it to a train, and then Lincoln would proceed on to Baltimore. So, as I mentioned, they took the carriage ride. And at that point, this is earlier the conductor, Daniel Garman, engineer Daniel Garman had told the conductor, Edward Black, that the rail splitter is on the train, and George Franciscus was the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, told him to hush up. So, they depart for Washington out of Baltimore. And Pinkerton, and all the while they're cutting telegraph lines. Just prior to cutting the last telegraph lines to Washington, Pinkerton sends a coded message said, plums delivered nuts safely, meaning that the president was on the train on his way to Washington. Now, of course, the Southerners said that Abraham Lincoln was dressed as a woman and as a coward for dodging us and not meeting the people of Baltimore. Had he done that, for all intent and purpose, he might have been assassinated. The inauguration took place on March 4th, 1861, where Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as the 16th president of the United States. There's a photograph that I won't show, but John Wilkes Booth was in attendance during the inauguration. He's sworn in. In fact, I'm going to show you a photograph of John Wilkes Booth. Ready? John Wilkes Booth, right? Lincoln, okay? And again, Lincoln and Booth. You can see how close he was. two different photographs during the inauguration, one with a hat, one without, John Wilkes Booth. Of course, he would become a person of interest and then would take the president's life by shooting him in the balcony of Ford's Theater on the evening of April 14, 1865. The Civil War would break out in 1861 as Fort Sumter in South Carolina was fired upon by the South. Booth, at the conclusion of Lincoln's first term, would assassinate him. There are all sorts of stories in terms of why the man who was charged with guarding the booth wasn't there, or guarding the box, I should say. I don't want to say booth. Whether he was lured away or if it was intentional. And there were other assassination attempts going on, an attempt on the life of the Vice President and Secretary of State. So in conclusion, some people have speculated, like Ward Hill Lamon, President Lincoln's bodyguard, said later in life that there was no conspiracy in Baltimore. Some historians back that claim. Allan Pinkerton would write a book later in his life detailing the entire scene and how he put it together and how he got Abraham Lincoln through Baltimore safely. So I want to thank you today. That's my lecture on the Baltimore Plot.